70 years of sweat, calluses, and dirt-stained hands taught Henry Caldwell one undeniable truth. The land doesn't care about your stock price. When a billion-dollar agriculture firm bulldozed into Red Creek, swallowing 3,000 acres next to his humble farm, executives laughed at his warnings. Satellite data and algorithms fuel their arrogance. Nature, however, has a brutal way of humbling the proud. What happened next wasn't just a corporate failure. It was a devastating reckoning that shook the entire industry. Frost still clung to the time-worn wooden beams of Henry Caldwell's front porch as he stood nursing a mug of black coffee. At 68, Henry was a fixture of Red Creek, Iowa, a man whose face was mapped with the same deep, weathered lines as the 400 acres of topographical farmland he had worked since he was a boy. He didn't farm with an iPad, and he didn't rely on Wall Street futures to tell him when to plant. He smelled the soil, watched the migration of the barn swallows, and felt the barometric drops in his aching left knee. For 3 generations, the Caldwells had lived in quiet harmony with the Stanton family, whose massive 3,000-acre estate bordered Henry's property to the east. The Stantons had been good neighbors. They understood the temperamental nature of the valley, a low-lying basin known locally as the Devil's Skillet, due to its deceptive drainage patterns and aggressive wind tunnels. But Old Man Stanton had passed away in November, and his children, city dwellers with no taste for diesel fumes and pre-dawn mornings, had quietly put the massive acreage on the market. Henry knew the land would sell, but he hadn't anticipated the sheer velocity and scale of the buyer. It started on a brisk Tuesday in early March. A fleet of glossy black Range Rovers and silver utility vehicles rolled down County Road 9, kicking up dust that settled over Henry's mailbox. The vehicles bore the crisp, minimalist logo of OmniHarvest LLC, a global agribusiness conglomerate famous for buying up family farms, consolidating them into massive mega-tractors runs, and squeezing every ounce of yield through heavy chemical applications and AI-driven agronomy. Within a week, Red Creek's quiet existence was shattered. OmniHarvest didn't just buy the land, they occupied it. The town was formally introduced to their new neighbor at a packed meeting in the high school gymnasium. Henry sat in the back row, his arms crossed over a faded flannel shirt, listening as a man named Derek Whitmore took the stage. Derek was OmniHarvest's vice president of regional operations. He wore a quarter-zip cashmere sweater, designer jeans that had never seen a speck of real mud, and a smile that looked aggressively rehearsed. Agriculture is no longer about hoping for rain and praying to the almanac. Derek boomed into the microphone, pacing the stage beneath a massive projection screen, displaying heat maps and satellite imagery. At OmniHarvest, we bring the future to the soil. We are implementing a synergistic, data-driven paradigm. We've mapped every square inch of the Stanton tract using military-grade LiDAR. We will be deploying autonomous machinery, precision hyperfertilization, and a proprietary high-yield seed matrix that will increase the county's output by 40% in year 1 alone. The crowd murmured. Some of the younger farmers looked impressed. Henry just stared. Derek pointed a laser pointer at the screen, zooming in on the boundary between the newly acquired OmniHarvest land and Henry's farm. To achieve maximum efficiency, we are stripping away the archaic borders. We are leveling the topographical inconsistencies to allow our autonomous mega-tractors an uninterrupted 3-mile linear run. Efficiency is king. Henry felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Topographical inconsistencies. That was corporate speak for leveling the subtle dips and rises that naturally managed the valley's water runoff. More alarmingly, Derek's map showed a straight red line cutting right through the century-old Osage orange and cottonwood windbreaks that separated the properties. After the presentation, while local politicians lined up to shake Derek's hand, Henry quietly walked up to the folding table where OmniHarvest's lead agronomist, Dr. Alan Pierce, was packing up his laptops. Alan was a sharp-featured man in his 30s who looked like he belonged in a Silicon Valley server room rather than a barn. "Excuse me," Henry said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Alan looked up, adjusting his glasses. "Can I help you?" "Henry Caldwell. I own the 400 acres on your western fence line." Derek Whitmore, noticing the interaction, strolled over, flashing his predatory smile. "Ah, Mr. Caldwell, our neighbor, Derek Whitmore. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. We're excited to bring some real value to Red Creek." "I saw your map," Henry said, ignoring Derek's outstretched hand. "You're planning to bulldoze the cottonwood windbreaks." "Ah, the old trees." "Yes," Derek said, dropping his hand, his smile faltering just a fraction. "They occupy nearly 15 acres of prime plantable soil, and their root systems interfere with our subsurface drip tape plans. Plus, they block the GPS signals for our autonomous fleets. They have to go." "Those trees aren't just scenery, son," Henry warned, locking eyes with the executive. "This valley is a wind corridor. Come late spring, the Red Creek howler whips through here at 40 miles an hour. Those trees have kept the Stanton topsoil from blowing into the next county for 100 years. Dr. Alan Pierce let out a patronizing chuckle, tapping his tablet. "Mr. Caldwell, our soil cohesion metrics are factored into our proprietary chemical binding agents. We don't rely on trees to hold our dirt together. Science has moved past folklore." "Science hasn't moved past gravity and wind," Henry replied evenly. "And what about the lower basin? Your map showed you leveling the South Ridge." "Maximizing arable acreage," Derek replied, crossing his arms. "It's a slight incline. It serves no purpose." "It serves a purpose," Henry countered. 2 feet beneath the topsoil in that lower basin is a solid pan of blue shale. It doesn't drain. That ridge you want to level acts as a natural diversion. If you flatten it and rip out the deep-rooted prairie grass, the water won't have anywhere to go. You run heavy machinery over that wet soil, you'll compact it right down to the shale. You won't have a farm, you'll have a concrete swamp." Derek sighed, the polite veneer wearing incredibly thin. He looked at Henry the way a modern architect might look at a child playing with mud pies. "Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate your historical perspective, but OmniHarvest has invested $22 million in this site. We have satellites orbiting the Earth right now, telling us exactly what that soil needs. We aren't going to base our operational parameters on the anecdotes of a local hobbyist." Henry held Derek's gaze for a long, silent moment. The sheer, blinding arrogance was almost physical in its intensity. "All right," Henry said softly. "You've got your satellites, but satellites don't have to walk through the mud when it rains." He turned and walked out of the gymnasium. The warning had been given. The fuse had been lit. Winter broke, giving way to a wet, aggressive spring. True to Derek Whitmore's word, OmniHarvest wasted no time. In early April, before the ground had even properly thawed, the heavy machinery arrived. Henry sat on his porch with a thermos of coffee, watching the destruction through a pair of battered binoculars. It was a mechanical invasion. Massive yellow excavators and industrial bulldozers roared to life just across the property line. The ground trembled beneath Henry's boots as the century-old Osage orange and towering cottonwood trees, the mighty guardians of the valley, were ruthlessly torn from the earth. The sound of snapping timber echoed across the hills like bone breaking. For a week, the horizon burned as OmniHarvest crews pushed the ancient trees into massive burn piles. Decades of natural habitat, wind protection, and root structure were turned to ash in the name of a straight, uninhibited GPS tractor path. Next came the earth movers. Just as Henry had feared, they descended upon the South Ridge. The natural, rolling contour of the land, which allowed heavy spring rains to gently cascade into the local watershed without pooling, was violently flattened. They scraped away the precious topsoil, leveled the ridge, and pushed the dirt into the lower basin, creating a massive, terrifyingly flat expanse. It looked pristine. It looked like a spreadsheet come to life, and Henry knew it was a ticking time bomb. One afternoon, unable to simply sit and watch the impending ecological suicide, Henry drove his beat-up 1998 Ford F-150 out to the property line. The dirt road bordering the 2 farms was choked with dust and the heavy stench of diesel. A sleek, mobile command center, a massive customized Airstream trailer, sat parked on a freshly paved gravel pad on the OmniHarvest side. Derek Whitmore stepped out, flanked by Dr. Alan Pierce. Both men wore pristine corporate-branded safety vests and hard hats, looking entirely out of place in the rugged Iowa landscape. Henry killed the engine of his truck and stepped out, the spring wind whipping his gray hair. "Henry, come to admire the progress?" Derek shouted over the low hum of a nearby generator. "We've cleared 300 acres this week alone. Efficiency." Henry walked up to the newly erected wire fence, separating his untouched, naturally contoured land from the flattened corporate wasteland. He pointed a calloused finger toward the lower basin, which was now a perfectly flat, dark brown grid. "You've leveled the basin," Henry said, his voice tight. "And I see your rig staging over on the county road. You're bringing in the 30-ton autonomous planters." "The Apex 9000S," Alan Pierce corrected, holding up his ubiquitous tablet. Fully automated. They run 24 hours a day, guided by our proprietary satellite network. No operator fatigue, perfectly spaced seating. "Why, the ground is too wet," Henry stated simply. "We had an inch of rain 3 days ago. The top looks dry because the wind is hitting it now that the trees are gone, but underneath it's soaked. Our sensors indicate a surface moisture level of 14%, Alan said smugly. Well within the acceptable planting parameters for our genetically modified seed. "I don't care what your sensors say," Henry warned, stepping closer to the fence. "I know this dirt. 2 feet down is the blue shale pan. If you put a 30-ton machine on that wet dirt, the weight is going to press all the air out of the soil. You're going to suffer massive soil compaction. The roots of your corn won't be able to penetrate the hard pan you're creating. When the heavy rains come in May, that water will hit the compacted soil, hit the shale, and sit there. You are building a bathtub." Derek rolled his eyes, clearly exasperated. "Mr. Caldwell, please. You're talking about agronomy like it's baking a cake. We are injecting a synthetic aerator compound along with our anhydrous ammonia. The chemical reaction will fracture any subsurface tension." "Chemicals don't fracture shale, Whitmore," Henry snapped, "and they don't stop the wind. Look at your dirt." Henry pointed across the field. Without the wind breaks to break the invisible currents racing down from the northern hills, a steady, low-hanging cloud of brown dust was constantly drifting off the omni-harvest land. The topsoil, the most valuable asset any farmer possessed, was literally blowing away. Alan squinted, waving his hand dismissively. "A minor, acceptable loss. We offset topsoil degradation with advanced synthetic nutrient loading. We control the environment, Mr. Caldwell. We don't bow to it." Henry looked at the two men. He saw no farmers. He saw accountants playing God with dirt they didn't respect. "My grandfather used to say," Henry muttered, turning back toward his truck, "that the land is like a mirror. You treat it with arrogance, it reflects disaster. You boys are about to learn a very expensive lesson." "Have a good season, Henry," Derek called out mockingly as Henry started his truck. "Try not to let our yields embarrass you too much at the co-op." As Henry drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror. The massive, soulless green and yellow Apex 9000s were rolling onto the freshly flattened dirt. Their massive treads sank deep into the earth, squeezing the life out of the soil with every revolution. The destruction had officially begun. May arrived in Red Creek not with a gentle whisper, but with a sudden, violent shift in barometric pressure. For the past month, the contrast between the two neighboring properties had become a stark visual testament to two entirely different philosophies of agriculture. On Henry Caldwell's side of the fence line, the farm was a symphony of deliberate, patient choices. He had waited 2 extra weeks for the soil temperature to rise naturally. He used his lighter, older tractor, a machine that respected the delicate capillary structure of the soil beneath its tires. He planted along the natural contours of the hills, creating subtle terraces that would hold moisture without drowning the roots. His fields were bordered by native grasses, and the soil was rich, dark, and porous. Across the fence, Omni Harvest's 3,000 acres looked like a desolate military installation. The immediate aftermath of their aggressive April planting was visually stunning to the untrained eye. Perfect, razor-straight rows of engineered corn, stretched to the horizon, unnervingly precise. But to Henry's experienced eye, the warning signs were already screaming. The first major consequence of OmniHarvest's arrogance was the wind. Without the towering cottonwoods and dense Osage orange trees to act as a buffer, the relentless valley crosswinds hammered the corporate acreage. Because the massive 30-ton autonomous tractors had compacted the earth so severely, the top layer of soil had turned into a fine, lifeless powder. Every afternoon, massive dust devils spun across the OmniHarvest fields, stripping away the expensive, nutrient-rich topsoil and carrying it miles away. Then, the second week of May delivered the promised heavy rains. It started as a steady downpour on a Tuesday evening and didn't let up for 48 hours. 3 inches of rain fell on Oak Haven Valley. Henry sat on his porch, listening to the rain drumming on the tin roof, sipping his coffee. His land drank the water eagerly. The healthy, uncompacted soil, rich in organic matter and aerated by deep roots, absorbed the rainfall like a sponge. What excess water there was flowed naturally down his carefully preserved, grassy waterways, filtering cleanly into the local creek. But over on the OmniHarvest side, a slow-motion catastrophe was unfolding. By Thursday morning, the skies cleared, and the sun beat down on Red Creek. Henry drove his truck to the fence line, a grim sense of validation settling in his chest. Derek Whitmore's flattened, highly efficient lower basin was entirely submerged. Because the heavy, 30-ton tractors had planted the fields when the deep soil was still damp, they had compressed the earth down to the solid blue shale pan just 2 feet below the surface. They had squeezed every microscopic pocket of oxygen out of the dirt, turning it into an impermeable layer of concrete. The 3 inches of rain had nowhere to go. It couldn't sink into the compacted earth, and because OmniHarvest had bulldozed the natural drainage ridges, it couldn't flow away. Over 600 acres of OmniHarvest's prime, chemically treated corn lay suffocating beneath 2 feet of stagnant, muddy water. Henry leaned against his truck as a pair of OmniHarvest SUVs came skidding down the dirt road, mud flying from their tires. They slammed to a halt near the submerged fields. Derek Whitmore practically leaped out of his vehicle, his previously pristine boots sinking deep into the muck. Dr. Alan Pierce scrambled out after him, desperately tapping at his tablet, looking panicked. "What is this?" Derek screamed, his voice echoing across the water. "Where is the drainage?" The topographic model said this sector would shed surface water at a rate of 2 inches per hour. The models didn't account for the subsurface impermeability. Alan stammered frantically, swiping screens. The water is just sitting on top of the shale layer. It's not percolating. The soil density metrics are off the charts. We have total hydraulic failure in sectors 4 through 9. Henry watched from the fence, his expression stoic. "Told you," he muttered to himself. Derek spun around, spotting Henry. His face was a mask of rage and panic. He stomped over to the fence, the mud sucking at his boots with every step. "Did you do something to the drainage culverts on your side?" Derek demanded, his composure completely shattered. "Are you blocking our runoff?" Henry didn't even blink. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pocket knife, and calmly scraped a piece of mud off his thumb. "My culverts are flowing just fine, Derek. Clear as a bell. The water on my side sank into the dirt where it belongs." "Then why is my field a lake?" Derek yelled. "Because you didn't listen," Henry replied softly, pointing his knife toward the massive stagnant pond. "I told you about the blue shale. I told you about the weight of your machines. You compacted the soil right down to the bedrock. You built a bathtub, and now your multi-million-dollar engineered seeds are drowning at the bottom of it." Alan rushed over, holding up his tablet as if it were a shield. "Sir, we need to bring in the emergency pump trucks. If the roots are submerged for more than 48 hours, we'll experience an 80% crop mortality rate in the lower basin." "Then get the pumps," Derek roared. "We can't," Alan replied, his voice trembling. "The ground outside the flooded zone is too slick from the rain. The pump trucks weigh 40 tons. If we drive them out there, they'll just sink to the axles and get stuck." Derek stared at the water, his chest heaving, the reality of his technological hubris finally piercing his corporate armor. day, millions of dollars of investment, thousands of hours of algorithmic planning, entirely defeated by a layer of old clay and 3 inches of rain. "It gets worse," Henry added casually, leaning over the fence. Derek glared at him, his eyes bloodshot. How could it possibly get worse? Henry pointed toward the northern horizon, where the sky was beginning to take on a strange, hazy yellow tint. The wind was picking up again. "The rain stopped, but the sun is out, and the wind is shifting," Henry said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge reading a sentence. "You tore out the windbreaks. Your topsoil up on the high ridge didn't flood, but it's sitting loose because your chemicals destroyed the organic root binders. The howler is coming, Derek." As if on cue, a massive gust of wind swept down through the valley. Without the towering cottonwoods to break its momentum, it slammed into the Omni-Harvest high ridge with terrifying force. Derek and Alan watched in horror as the drying topsoil on their upper fields, loaded with highly toxic, concentrated synthetic fertilizers and expensive proprietary seed, began to lift. It didn't just blow. It erupted into a massive, suffocating dust storm, sweeping across the corporate fields like a plague, leaving Henry's protected, deep-rooted farm entirely untouched. Nature had issued its first invoice, and Omni-Harvest was about to realize they couldn't afford the cost. Dust settled over Red Creek like a suffocating shroud. By the time the Red Creek howler finally blew itself out, 3 days later, the landscape had fundamentally changed. What was supposed to be a triumph of modern agribusiness had transformed into an environmental disaster zone, and the entire county was choking on the consequences. Omni-Harvest's catastrophic miscalculation wasn't just confined to their side of the property line anymore. The sheer volume of topsoil stripped from their high ridge, carrying with it concentrated doses of pre-emergent herbicides and synthetic nitrogen, had drifted over the county road, coating the town of Red Creek in a toxic, gritty film. Cars were blanketed in brown powder. The local elementary school had to keep children indoors for recess because the airborne particulate matter was triggering asthma attacks. At the local diner, farmers who had previously marveled at Omni-Harvest's sleek technology now sat in stony silence, wiping dust off their coffee cups and muttering about corporate stupidity. On Henry Caldwell's farm, the contrast was almost miraculous. His deep-rooted prairie grass borders and the remaining shelter belts of oak and hickory he maintained on his northern perimeter had acted as a fortress. The dust storm had slammed into his tree line and dropped, leaving his carefully terraced, nutrient-dense fields pristine. His corn was already pushing through the soil, a vibrant, healthy green. Across the fence, desperation had taken hold. Derek Whitmore's Airstream Command Center was now a hive of panicked activity. The stock market was unforgiving. Local news choppers had captured footage of the flooded lower basin and the barren upper ridge, and Omni-Harvest's shares had dipped by 2% in a single morning. For a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, a 2% drop translated to hundreds of millions in lost market capitalization. The board of directors in Chicago was demanding immediate remediation. "Get the water out of that basin," Derek screamed at Dr. Alan Pierce, his voice hoarse from inhaling dust. "I don't care what it costs. Hire every piece of aviation equipment in the tri-state area." What followed was a spectacle of absolute absurdity. Unable to drive heavy pump trucks into the muddy swamp without sinking them, Omni-Harvest resorted to airborne tactics. They hired a fleet of 6 heavy-lift helicopters, the kind usually reserved for fighting forest fires or constructing skyscrapers. Henry stood by his fence line, leaning on a wooden post, watching the circus unfold. The helicopters hovered low over the submerged 600 acres, their massive rotor wash attempting to literally blow the stagnant water off the fields and accelerate evaporation. The deafening roar of the engines echoed through the valley from dawn until dusk. It was an incredibly expensive, hilariously ineffective band-aid. The water simply rippled and sloshed, trapped by the impermeable blue shale hardpan underneath. "You can't bully nature with a checkbook," Henry murmured to his farm dog, a scruffy terrier named Buster, who sat panting at his boots. "She always charges interest." Worse still, the rotor wash from the helicopters created artificial wind currents that kicked up even more of the loose, dry dirt from the surrounding unflooded areas, exacerbating the dust problem. By the end of the week, the stagnant water in the basin began to fester. Without oxygen, anaerobic bacteria took over, a foul, sulfurous stench. The smell of rotting organic matter and drowning seeds drifted across the property lines. The expensive, proprietary seeds, genetically engineered to resist drought and herbicides, stood zero chance against being submerged in a toxic tea of their own melting chemical coatings. The mortality rate in the lower basin was total, but the flooded basin was only half the disaster. The upper ridge, stripped of its topsoil, was about to become the breeding ground for a completely different kind of nightmare. OmniHarvest had assumed their algorithms could predict every variable. They forgot that when you destroy an ecosystem, nature abhors a vacuum, and something was waiting to fill it. Late June brought a brutal, baking heat wave to the valley. The temperatures soared past 95 degrees, and the air grew thick and stagnant. On Henry's farm, the natural humidity retained by his healthy soil and the shading provided by his mature crops created a microclimate that kept his fields resilient. His corn was chest-high, the stalks thick and dark green. Ladybugs, lacewings, and predatory wasps, the natural defenders of any balanced agricultural ecosystem, patrolled his acres, keeping pest populations in check. Over on OmniHarvest's high ridge, the situation was dire. The crops that had survived the dust storm were stunted, their roots struggling to find nutrients in the aggressively degraded, compacted subsoil, because the corporate farm had preemptively blanketed the entire 3,000 acres with a broad-spectrum, highly toxic insecticide via drone earlier in the season. They had completely wiped out every beneficial insect in the area. Alan Pierce's computer models dictated that the chemical shield would protect the stressed plants, but the AI had a blind spot. Spider mites. Two-spotted spider mites thrive in hot, aggressively dry, and dusty conditions, exactly the artificial environment OmniHarvest had created on their high ridge. Furthermore, spider mites reproduce at terrifying speeds when their natural predators are exterminated by broad-spectrum sprays. It started as a subtle yellowing on the lower leaves of the corporate corn. Alan Pierce's drones, flying at 200 feet, registered the discoloration as a slight nutrient deficiency. The algorithm, running without human ground truthing, automatically deployed irrigation pivots to spray synthetic nitrogen over the affected sectors. It was the equivalent of pouring gasoline on a fire. The extra nitrogen caused a flush of sappy, weak growth in the stressed plants, providing the ultimate feast for the mites. Within 10 days, the yellowing turned into a catastrophic blight. Millions upon millions of microscopic arachnids spun fine silken webs over the stunted corn, sucking the sap right out of the plant cells. The leaves turned brown, brittle, and dead. Henry noticed the shift one humid Tuesday afternoon. He was checking his eastern fence line when he saw the telltale dusty webbing creeping up the stalks on the OmniHarvest side. He pulled a magnifying glass from his chest pocket, a tool he had used for 40 years, and inspected a dying leaf protruding through the wire fence. The underside was crawling with a writhing red and yellow mass. He looked toward the corporate command center. A sleek white SUV was parked near the edge of the dying field. Alan Pierce was standing there, staring at his tablet, looking utterly bewildered. Henry climbed over the wooden stile and walked over to the property line. "Mites," Henry said simply, his voice cutting through the hum of a distant generator. Alan jumped, nearly dropping his tablet. He looked at Henry, his face pale and slick with sweat. The spectral imaging flagged it as a nitrogen deficiency. We treated it. The modeling didn't predict an infestation event of this magnitude until late August. Models don't account for you turning the soil into an oven and killing every ladybug in a 5-mile radius, Henry said, shaking his head. You stressed the plants. You gave them a nitrogen spike. You served the mites a buffet on a silver platter. We can spray, Alan muttered frantically, swiping at his screen. We have a proprietary miticide. We can deploy the heavy drone swarm. It's too late for that, Henry warned. The webbing is too thick. Your chemical drops won't penetrate the canopy to hit the underside of the leaves where they feed. The only way to beat a mite infestation this bad is a heavy soaking rain or natural predators, and you've got neither. Alan glared at Henry, the arrogance returning as a defense mechanism against his own incompetence. We don't rely on bugs to fight our battles, Caldwell. We rely on chemistry. We are launching the swarm. That evening, the sky above the Omni-Harvest Ridge darkened with a fleet of massive, autonomous spraying drones. They buzzed like mechanical hornets, dumping hundreds of gallons of harsh, specialized miticide over the dying crops. But Henry was right. The silken webs acted as a hydrophobic shield, causing the expensive chemicals to bead up and roll off. The mites continued to gorge. Within 2 weeks, nearly 800 acres of the high ridge had turned into a brown, withered wasteland. Omni-Harvest had now lost a massive chunk of their crops to water and another massive chunk to drought and pests. Their projected 40% yield increase had evaporated. They were staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar loss. Cornered animals, however, are the most dangerous. And Derek Whitmore, facing the destruction of his career and the wrath of his corporate board, was not about to go down without finding a scapegoat. August descended on the valley with a suffocating heavy heat. Omni-Harvest's 3,000-acre mega-farm was a patchwork of failure. The flooded basin had finally dried into a cracked, barren expanse of dead stalks in foul-smelling earth, while the high ridge was a spider-mite graveyard. Only Henry Caldwell's 400 acres stood as an oasis of deep, thriving green. The contrast was a brutal, visible indictment of Omni-Harvest's methods, visible to anyone driving down County Road 9. It was a Tuesday morning when the Blacktown cars arrived. Henry was in his barn, replacing a worn belt on his combine, when Buster started barking aggressively. Henry wiped the grease from his hands with a rag and walked out into the blinding sunlight. 3 vehicles were parked in his gravel driveway. Derek Whitmore stepped out of the lead car. He looked older, his face drawn, the polished corporate veneer entirely stripped away. Beside him was a tall, sharply dressed man carrying a leather briefcase, the unmistakable silhouette of a corporate litigator. 2 other men, wearing shirts bearing the logo of a private environmental testing firm, stepped out of the trailing vehicles. "Whitmore," Henry said, standing his ground by the barn doors, the heavy wrench still in his hand. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Cut the folksy act, Henry," Derek spat, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "We know what you did." Henry raised an eyebrow. "I woke up, drank coffee, and fixed a belt on a 30-year-old combine. What exactly is it you think I did?" The man with the briefcase stepped forward, his expression cold and clinical. "Mr. Caldwell, my name is Simon Fletcher. I am Senior Legal Counsel for Omni-Harvest, LLC. We are formally serving you with a cease and desist order, as well as a notice of intent to sue for tortious interference, property damage, and agricultural sabotage." He thrust a thick manila envelope toward Henry. Henry didn't take it. He just stared at the lawyer. "Sabotage." Henry let out a short, harsh laugh. "You boys drowned your own seed in a bathtub of your own making, and you let mites eat the rest because you sprayed away the food chain. Don't go looking for ghosts when you're the one holding the gun." "What? You altered the watershed," Derek shouted, taking a step forward. "And we had independent hydrologists review the topography. The only reason our lower basin flooded with that intensity is if the natural water table was artificially diverted from the western ridge. Your ridge." "That's a lie, and you know it," Henry said, his voice dropping an octave, hard as flint. "My land hasn't been terraformed in 100 years. I have grass waterways. You bulldozed the natural contour, compacted the soil to the bedrock, and trapped the water. We also have drone footage of you standing by the fence line just days before the spider mite infestation decimated our Sector 7, Simon Fletcher added smoothly. "Given that your fields remain suspiciously untouched by the blight, we have reason to believe you purposefully introduced the pest vector to our property." Henry stared at them, genuinely stunned by the sheer audacity of the accusation. They were projecting their algorithmic failures onto him, trying to bury him in legal fees to mask their incompetence from their shareholders. "You think I walked over and sprinkled bugs on your corn?" Henry asked, incredulous. "Are you out of your minds?" "We are seeking $25 million in damages," Simon Fletcher stated, dropping the envelope at Henry's feet. "We will be filing an injunction to freeze your assets pending the investigation. You played a dangerous game, Mr. Caldwell. You cannot fight a billion-dollar company." Before Henry could respond, the crunch of heavy tires on gravel interrupted them. A white, heavy-duty pickup truck adorned with the official seal of the State Department of Agriculture rolled down the driveway, pulling up right behind the sleek corporate cars. A man stepped out. He wore practical work boots, faded denim, and a khaki shirt with a badge clipped to the pocket. He had the rugged, exhausted look of a man who spent his life arguing with stubborn farmers and corporate suits alike. "Morning, folks," the man said, adjusting a battered baseball cap. "I'm Inspector Douglas Mitchell, State Agricultural and Environmental Compliance." Derek Whitmore frowned, looking at his lawyer. "Oh, we didn't call the state inspectors." "No, you didn't," Douglas Mitchell said, pulling a thick clipboard from his truck. "But the town of Red Creek did, the local water board did, and the EPA field office in Des Moines did." Inspector Mitchell walked right past the corporate executives and extended a hand to Henry. "Mr. Caldwell, good to see you again. Sorry about the commotion." "Doug," Henry nodded, shaking his hand. "It's been a while." Mitchell turned to face Derek and the lawyer. "Satai, Mr. Whitmore, I've spent the last 3 days conducting deep core soil samples and chemical runoff tests on the municipal drainage systems that run adjacent to your 3,000 acres. Our operations are entirely within federal guidelines." Simon Fletcher snapped immediately. "Your operations," Mitchell countered, his voice rising, "are an ecological catastrophe. I'm not here about your yields. I'm here about the 400 pounds of synthetic anhydrous ammonia and concentrated miticides that washed off your compacted dirt and into the Red Creek municipal watershed during the May floods." Derek went pale. That's impossible. Our binding agents..." "Your binding agents failed because you destroyed the soil structure," Mitchell interrupted sharply. "We pulled core samples from your lower basin. You've achieved a 98% compaction rate down to the shale layer. You essentially paved it. When the water couldn't sink, it ran off laterally, taking all your toxic surface treatments directly into the town's water supply." Mitchell flipped a page on his clipboard, pulling out a sheet stamped in bright red ink. "I am issuing an immediate state-mandated cease of operations for Omni Harvest, LLC on this site. You are facing millions in environmental cleanup fines, a mandate to remediate the watershed, and potential criminal negligence charges for endangering the municipal water supply." Derek looked like he had been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Simon Fletcher, the corporate attack dog, suddenly looked very interested in his shoes. "Furthermore," Mitchell continued, glancing at the manila envelope on the ground, "I overheard your accusation of sabotage. I strongly advise you to drop it. My entomology report confirms that the spider mite outbreak was a direct result of your broad-spectrum drone spraying, which wiped out the local predator populations. Mr. Caldwell's fields survived because his organic borders maintain a thriving population of Harmonia axiritis, Asian lady beetles. Nature did its job. You failed at yours." Henry looked at Derek Whitmore. The executive's cashmere sweater and expensive haircut couldn't hide the absolute ruin in his eyes. The arrogance had been entirely burned away, leaving only the crushing weight of a failure that no algorithm could fix. "I told you, Whitmore," Henry said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the heavy summer air. "The land is a mirror. You treated it with arrogance, and now you're looking at the reflection." 400 miles away from the muddy, foul-smelling disaster of Red Creek, the atmosphere inside Omni Harvest's Chicago headquarters was frigid. The executive boardroom on the 52nd floor was a monument to corporate power. Sheer glass, polished mahogany, and panoramic views of a city that felt entirely disconnected from the dirt that fed it. But on this humid Monday morning in late August, the men and women sitting around the massive table looked like they were attending a funeral. In a way, they were. They were mourning the catastrophic death of a paradigm. Evelyn Reed, the chief executive officer of Omni Harvest, stood at the head of the table. She was a woman known for her icy composure and ruthless efficiency. She did not yell. She didn't need to. Her silence was terrifying enough. Displayed on the 70-inch OLED monitor behind her was drone footage of the Red Creek site. The imagery was damning. It showed the cracked, desolate wasteland of the lower basin, completely devoid of life, and the brown, web-choked graveyard of the high ridge. Beside the video was a scrolling ticker showing the company's stock price, which had plummeted nearly 14% since the state EPA had issued its public cease operations order. Derek Whitmore sat near the middle of the table. He was sweating through his bespoke suit. He looked nothing like the arrogant, cashmere-clad conqueror who had stood in the Red Creek High School gymnasium 6 months prior. Beside him sat Dr. Alan Pierce, whose eyes remained glued to his laptop screen, furiously reviewing code as if a hidden line of syntax could somehow reverse the laws of nature. "Let me ensure I fully understand the magnitude of our current position," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into the quiet room like a stone into a deep well. She picked up a thick binder stamped with the seal of the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. "We acquired 3,000 acres of prime, legacy topsoil for $22 million. We invested an additional $6 million in autonomous machinery, proprietary seed matrices, and synthetic chemical treatments." She let the numbers hang in the air before turning her piercing gaze directly onto Derek. "And in less than 6 months, Vice President Whitmore, you have managed to turn a $28 million investment into a toxic liability. We have zero harvestable yield. We have destroyed the subsurface drainage network. We have triggered a localized ecological collapse." "Evelyn, the weather models," Derek started, his voice cracking slightly. "Do not speak to me about weather models, Derek," Evelyn snapped, her composure finally fracturing. "This wasn't a hurricane. It was 3 inches of rain and a high wind. Do you know what the state EPA is doing right now? They are testing the municipal wells of Red Creek. Because of your decision to bulldoze the natural watersheds and compact the earth into concrete, 400 pounds of our proprietary, highly concentrated midicides washed into the local water table." Charles Montgomery, the company's chief financial officer, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Evelyn is right, Derek. This is no longer an agricultural failure. It is an environmental disaster. The state has levied an initial fine of $4.5 million for watershed contamination. But the real threat is the class action lawsuit from the town. If a single child in Red Creek gets sick and they trace it back to our chemical runoff, we are looking at hundreds of millions in punitive damages. The board is terrified." "We can remediate it," Derek pleaded, slamming his hand on the table. "We just need more time. We can bring in deep tillage rigs. We can inject synthetic biome activators to rebuild the soil structure. Alan has a new algorithm for hyper-localized drone repair." "Stop!" Alan Pierce suddenly interjected, his voice quiet but sharp. He finally closed his laptop and looked at Derek, then at Evelyn. "Dr. Pierce?" Evelyn asked, raising an eyebrow. Alan took a deep breath, looking like a man waking up from a long, delusional dream. "Derek is lying, or he's delusional. Either way, the algorithms failed. I failed. We can't code our way out of this." Derek stared at his lead agronomist, utterly betrayed. "Alan, what are you doing?" "I'm telling the truth," Alan said, turning to the board. "We ignored the historical data. The local farmer, Caldwell, warned us about the blue shale pan. He warned us about the wind shear. I overrode his warnings because my models prioritize linear efficiency over topographical reality. I thought I could engineer a perfect environment. I was wrong. The soil is dead. The biological matrix is completely sterilized from the midicide drops. It's essentially a parking lot covered in toxic dust." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the boardroom. "How long to fix it, Dr. Pierce?" Evelyn asked coldly. "Using traditional means. If we threw out the tech and just tried to heal the dirt, how long?" "To reverse the compaction and rebuild the organic matter enough to support a profitable commercial crop." Alan calculated for a moment. 5 to 7 years. Minimum. And it will require millions in cover cropping and deep ripping without yielding a single dime of profit during that time. Charles Montgomery let out a heavy sigh, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. We don't have 5 years. The shareholders are panicking. The environmental liabilities are compounding daily. Every day our name is on the deed to that land. We are exposed to the municipal water contamination lawsuit. Evelyn Reed slowly closed the DNR binder. She had made her decision. The ruthless pragmatism that had built OmniHarvest would now be used to dismantle its greatest failure. "We are bleeding out," Evelyn announced, her tone absolute, "and the only way to save the patient is amputation." "Evelyn, you can't be serious," Derek gasped. "If we abandon the site, we validate every critic who says corporate farming is unsustainable. It's a PR nightmare." "The PR nightmare's already here, Derek," Evelyn replied icily. "The financial nightmare is what I am trying to stop. Charles, I want the Stanton tract liquidated immediately. Put it up for absolute public auction by the end of the month. No reserve. Cut our losses, pay the EPA fines, and legally detach OmniHarvest from that property before the town's lawyers can tie us to the watershed." Selling 3,000 acres of poison, compacted dirt with no reserve? Charles grimaced. "We'll take a massive write-down. We'll be lucky to get 30 cents on the dollar." "I don't care if we get 10 cents on the dollar," Evelyn said, walking back to her seat. "Get it off our balance sheet now." She looked back at Derek Whitmore, her eyes devoid of any sympathy. "As for you, Derek, clear out your desk. You're fired. Security will escort you out of the building. Let this be a lesson to the rest of you. We may use satellites to guide our tractors, but down in the dirt, gravity and water still make the rules." September in Iowa usually carried the sweet, dusty scent of the impending harvest. Golden corn stalks and amber soybeans stretched out beneath vast, brilliant blue skies, waiting for the combines to roll. But on the 3,000 acres of the former Stanton tract, there was only the smell of sour earth and the haunting silence of a dead landscape. The absolute auction was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, held inside the very same Red Creek High School gymnasium where OmniHarvest had arrogantly declared their dominion over the valley. Only this time, there were no catered pastries, no laser pointers, and no glossy presentations. The mood in the gymnasium was tense, heavy with the weight of communal schadenfreude. The bleachers were packed with local farmers wearing seed caps and worn denim, murmuring quietly among themselves. They had come to watch the giant fall. At the front of the room, behind a folding table, sat Simon Fletcher, OmniHarvest's icy corporate litigator, looking deeply uncomfortable in the rural setting. Next to him was a high-end commercial auctioneer, brought in from Chicago, a man used to selling skyscrapers and luxury estates, not ruined farmland. Henry Caldwell sat on the front row. He wore his Sunday suit, a slightly faded gray wool number that he usually reserved for weddings and funerals. Today, it felt appropriate for both. Beside him sat Frank Sullivan, the president of the Red Creek Community Bank, clutching a thick leather folder. "All right, gentlemen, let's get this over with." The auctioneer spoke into the microphone, his voice lacking its usual theatrical cadence. "We are here to auction the property known as the Stanton Tract, comprising 3,040 acres of agricultural land. The property is sold strictly as is, where is. The buyer assumes all environmental liabilities and necessary remediation mandates as outlined by the state EPA. A low chuckle rippled through the bleachers. Everyone in the room knew what environmental liabilities meant. It meant millions of dollars in deep tillage and cover crop planting before a single kernel of corn could be harvested. "We will open the bidding at $10 million, the auctioneer announced, trying to sound confident. "Do I have 10 million? Silence. Not a single hand moved. A cough echoed from the back of the gym. Simon Fletcher adjusted his tie, his jaw tight. 10 million was already less than half of what OmniHarvest had paid just 6 months ago. "Okay, let's start the bidding at 8 million, the auctioneer tried again. $8 million for 3,000 acres. That's a fraction of the market value, folks. More silence. The farmers in the bleachers just stared. They weren't foolish. Prime Iowa farmland was going for $10,000 an acre. But this wasn't prime farmland anymore. It was a compacted, sterilized brick. To buy it was to buy a massive, expensive problem. The auctioneer looked at Simon Fletcher, panic flashing in his eyes. Fletcher gave him a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. "Sell it, At any cost, get the liability off the books. 5 million, the auctioneer said, his voice dropping. Do I have 5 million? Nothing. The silence was deafening. It was the sound of a community collectively rejecting the arrogance of a corporation. OmniHarvest had treated their home like a spreadsheet, and now the spreadsheet was bankrupt. $2 million, the auctioneer pleaded, sweating slightly under the gym lights. Folks, the scrap value of the irrigation pivots alone is worth $500,000. $2 million to open. From the front row, Henry Caldwell slowly stood up. The entire gymnasium went dead quiet. Henry didn't look at the auctioneer. He looked directly at Simon Fletcher. I won't give you $2 million, Henry said, his voice calm, echoing clearly in the silent room. Because it's going to cost me at least $3 million to undo the damage your client did to this valley. Simon Fletcher glared at the old farmer. Mr. Caldwell, this is an auction, not a town hall. If you have a bid, make it. I have a bid, Henry said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I spent the last 3 weeks on the phone with the State Conservation Office. Because your company created a localized ecological disaster, the state is offering a highly specific emergency grant to any local entity willing to take on the burden of fully remediating the watershed and restoring the native windbreaks. Henry turned back to the crowd. Frank Sullivan here, and I have formed a cooperative trust. Every farmer in this room who lost topsoil to your dust storms, who had their water threatened by your runoff, has a stake in it. He turned back to the lawyer, his eyes burning with a fierce, quiet intensity. My bid is $1,200,000, Henry stated firmly. $400 an acre, not a penny more. And you're going to take it, Fletcher, because if I sit down, you carry that EPA liability back to Chicago, and your stock drops another 10% by tomorrow morning. The gymnasium erupted into shocked whispers. $400 an acre was an insult. It was a price from the 1970s. It was financial humiliation. The auctioneer looked at Simon Fletcher, completely lost. Fletcher's face was pale. He pulled out his cell phone, his hand shaking slightly, and speed dialed Chicago. The gym waited in tense silence as Fletcher stepped into the hallway. Through the small window in the gym doors, the crowd could see Fletcher pacing, arguing frantically, running a hand through his hair. 5 minutes later, he walked back in. He looked defeated, hollowed out. He didn't speak into the microphone. He just looked at the auctioneer and gave a single, rigid nod. The auctioneer swallowed hard. I have a bid of $1.2 million. Do I have 1.3? 1.3. Silence. Going once. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Going twice. The silence held, thick and heavy. Smack. Sold for $1.2 million to the Cooperative Trust of Mr. Henry Caldwell. The bleachers erupted. Farmers leapt to their feet, cheering, clapping, throwing their seed caps into the air. It wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was a victory for the soil. It was a victory for the people who actually understood the land. Henry didn't celebrate. He just turned to Frank Sullivan and shook his hand. Then he looked out the high window of the gymnasium toward the eastern horizon where the Stanton tract lay wounded. We got the land back, Frank, Henry murmured quietly. Now the real work begins. The scars of corporate hubris are not erased overnight. You cannot command a seed to grow in dead earth any more than you can command the rain to stop. True agriculture is a partnership, not a dictatorship. And Henry Caldwell was a master partner. 3 years passed. The story of OmniHarvest's spectacular implosion became a cautionary tale taught in university agronomy classes across the Midwest. The billion-dollar conglomerate retreated from Red Creek, their reputation permanently tarnished, a brutal reminder that algorithms and satellites are useless if they aren't grounded in fundamental ecological respect. But out in the Devil's Skillet, the landscape was quietly, painfully transforming. The process of healing the 3,000 acres was grueling. It began that first autumn after the auction. Henry, along with a dozen local farmers who had bought into the cooperative, drove heavy tractors equipped with massive steel subsoiler shanks onto the compacted lower basin. They didn't plant corn or soybeans. They simply ripped the earth open, dragging the massive steel blades 3 feet deep. fracturing the suffocating concrete-like hardpan that Omni-Harvest's 30-ton machines had created. The sound of the steel tearing through the compacted clay echoed through the valley for weeks. Next came the bio drills. Instead of cash crops, Henry blanketed the torn earth with hundreds of thousands of pounds of daikon radish seed and winter rye. When spring arrived, the fields didn't look like a traditional farm. They were a wild, chaotic sea of thick green foliage. The radishes drove their massive, aggressive taproots deep into the fractured soil, naturally expanding the channels the steel rippers had made. When the radishes died back, they decomposed in the ground, leaving massive vertical holes that allowed water to finally percolate down to the water table. The rotting biomass reinoculated the sterilized dirt with vital organic matter, inviting earthworms and essential microbes back into the desolate wasteland. It was a brilliant, old-school application of regenerative agriculture. They were using nature to heal nature. On the high ridge, the focus was protection. Using the state conservation grant, the community mobilized to replant the windbreaks. Hundreds of volunteers, from high school 4-H clubs to retired mechanics, spent weekends planting saplings along the historical boundary lines. They planted fast-growing hybrid poplars for immediate wind deflection, mixed with slow-growing, resilient oaks and Osage orange trees for the next generation. They didn't spray broad-spectrum miticides. They planted borders of wildflowers and native prairie grasses, creating a welcoming habitat for predatory insects. Slowly, miraculously, the ladybugs returned. The lacewings returned. The balance of the ecosystem, so violently disrupted by Alan Pierce's drone swarms, began to stabilize. By the third year, the transformation was undeniable. It was a late afternoon in October, the air crisp and carrying the unmistakable, earthy scent of healthy soil. Henry Caldwell, now 71 but moving with the spry energy of a man 20 years younger, sat on his front porch. His loyal dog, Buster, lay at his feet, snoring softly. Henry held a steaming mug of coffee, watching the horizon. The 3,000 acres next door no longer looked like a sterile corporate grid, nor did they look like a disaster zone. They looked alive. The lower basin, once a stagnant, foul-smelling bathtub, was now a thriving expanse of late-season soybeans, the leaves turning a rich, golden yellow. The natural drainage contours had been carefully restored, guiding the autumn rains gently toward the creek without pooling. Up on the high ridge, the young poplars of the new windbreaks were already 10 feet tall, their leaves rustling aggressively against the wind, doing exactly what they were meant to do, protecting the precious topsoil. A familiar white pickup truck crunched down the gravel driveway. Inspector Douglas Mitchell stepped out, pulling his clipboard from the cab. He walked up to the porch, a genuine smile breaking across his tired face. "Afternoon, Henry," Mitchell said, leaning against the wooden railing. "Just did the quarterly soil and water tests on the cooperative acreage." "And?" Henry asked, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "And," Mitchell grinned, "your organic matter is up by 2 full percentage points. Compaction is completely eliminated down to the 30-inch mark, and the water runoff entering Red Creek is testing cleaner than it has in 20 years. Mitchell looked out over the fields, shaking his head in quiet awe. "I'll be honest, Henry, 3 years ago when you bought that land at auction, I thought you were buying a cemetery. I didn't think it could be brought back in my lifetime." "The dirt wants to live, Doug," Henry said quietly, his eyes sweeping over the vast rolling green and gold landscape. "It knows what to do. You just have to stop suffocating it, stop poisoning it, and give it the tools to breathe. Omni-Harvest tried to treat this valley like a factory floor. They forgot that we aren't manufacturing crops. We're stewarding life." Mitchell nodded slowly, tapping his clipboard against his leg. "Well, you and the cooperative proved them wrong. You saved the valley, Henry." "I didn't save it," Henry corrected him, setting his mug down on the railing. He looked at his calloused, dirt-stained hands, hands that had worked this same valley for a lifetime. "The land saved itself. I just finally gave it a chance to speak." As the sun began to dip below the newly planted tree lines, casting long, golden shadows across the revitalized fields, Henry leaned back in his chair, the harsh, mechanical roar of autonomous megatractors and corporate helicopters was gone, replaced by the gentle rustle of the wind through the crops and the distant, returning call of a red-tailed hawk. The corporation had brought millions of dollars, satellites, and arrogance. But in the end, it was patience, respect, and a stubborn old farmer that brought the dirt back to life. If you love this story of an underdog farmer outsmarting a billion-dollar corporation and letting nature fight back, please hit that like button. It helps the channel grow and tells the algorithm we want more real, grounded stories. Share this video with anyone who appreciates the value of hard work, common sense, and the beauty of rural life. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Have you ever seen a big company fail because they ignored local wisdom? Tell me down in the comments.